Across Asia and around the world, scam networks are evolving into highly coordinated, cross-border operations that behave more like multinational enterprises than isolated criminal groups. They impersonate banks, governments, police, friends, family at massive scale, and increasingly use artificial intelligence to automate fraud, personalize lures, and move faster than traditional defenses can inevitably respond. And at the same time, the platforms that are fighting them are dealing with unprecedented complexity, multilingual environments, sophisticated adversarial testing, and the rise of AI-generated content as well, and networks that can rebuild themselves overnight or maybe even immediately. I mean, it's really quick, the stuff that they can do. And the front line is no longer just about catching a bad ad or blocking a fake account. It's about tracking entire criminal life cycles, disrupting infrastructure, and coordinating with banks, telcos, regulators, and global threat sharing groups. How are we supposed to defend billions of people against adversaries who are constantly reinvesting, retooling, and reinventing themselves? This episode of the Asia Tech Podcast wants to know, how have global scam operators become so organized, so scalable, and so resilient? What new role does AI play, if any, for both the attackers and defenders across the fraud lifecycle? And what cross-industry systems, signals, and partnerships are still missing? What do we need to build next? To help us unpack all of this and more, ATP is joined by David Agranovich, Director of Global Threat Disruption at Meta. David, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thank you so much for having me on.
It's my complete pleasure. Okay, let's do this thing. For listeners who don't necessarily follow this space so closely, what does the threat landscape look like in 2025? And to be fair, if you could compare it to maybe 5 or 7 years ago, I think that would be helpful as well.
Absolutely. So I've been working in various parts of national security now for almost 2 decades, but I've been at Meta now for about 7 years. And when I first joined the company, the problem set that we were focused on was how do we counter a new type of threat, right? Foreign actors, oftentimes sophisticated, government aligned, that were targeting everything from people's information through hacking and malware to elections, right, through foreign interference and fake accounts. And what we realized at the time was we need a different model. And so you mentioned I'm the director of threat disruption. Threat disruption is essentially this idea that platform companies can go beyond content moderation to build teams that can do deep intelligence analysis and look for the networks of whether they're scammers and fraudsters, influence operators, hackers, build out our understanding of what their network looks like on our services, take them down in one big coordinated action, but then help enable our partners, so other companies, other platforms, law enforcement, and governments where appropriate, to hold those threat actors accountable. Right? These are not groups or individuals that are accidentally violating our services.
No.
Right? They're trying to use our services to go after people. And so, 5, 6, 7 years ago, when I started working on these problems, the threat actor space looked like a number of kind of nation state governments and their proxies that might be targeting elections. You saw kind of scam activity, both online and through phones, emails, phishing. But in many ways, it was far less complex, far less sophisticated, far less aggressive than what you see today. One of the big inflection points was around when COVID hit. And so when COVID happened, particularly in Asia, a bunch of these organized criminal groups that made money off of criminal activity offline, right? Street drug sales and other crime that happened out there off the internet, suddenly found themselves operating in countries where nobody was going outside. And all of a sudden, a lot of people were spending a lot more time online. And so you saw a massive spike in not just online scam activity, but these sophisticated multinational organized criminal organizations getting into the online scams and frauds game and really expanding the amount that they were targeting people around the world. And so I would say, of all the problem areas that we focus on, fraudsters and scammers remain among the most aggressive and the most adversarial of the ones that we counter on the platform.
I want to ask you this in the right way, but I feel like I get a lot of email. I know that's off platform, but I get a lot of email where it's so clear to me, and maybe I'm just too sophisticated for this, that it's fraud, right? I literally mouse over some stuff and I'm like, yeah, this is not meant for just me. This has been sent to millions and millions of people to get you to click on this thing. But I'm curious, because I've never spoken to anybody that does what you do, I'm curious what the life cycle is of one of these things. I'm sure they're trying to get money from me at some level. Right? Otherwise, why would they do this? There's not enough information on my computer really for them to like be happy about stealing my email addresses anymore. That seems like a little bit of unnecessary energy to me. But like, what's the life cycle of one of these things? What is, maybe if you can just run through like what a fraud and a scam looks like at scale, so that I can get a better understanding about what it actually is, and how they actually end up with the money, if that's okay to ask.
Absolutely. And I think you actually hit the nail on the head when you started describing the problem, right? You might get an email, and that's not on our platform. But these operations, almost every scam or fraud that we see is inherently cross-platform, right? It might touch our services. It will also touch email, cell phones, text messages. I'm sure you and everyone else listening to the podcast have gotten one of those text messages from someone just saying hello, or, oh, you missed our date next week, that are the lead into a scam.
I get a text message all the time saying like, your big platform email address has been hacked into. Please click here to reset your password. And I'm like, nice try. But yeah, sorry, go ahead. So you're right. Even if it's not on platform, it's almost always platform related in a way that I see it. Sorry, go ahead.
Absolutely. And so maybe what I can do is, if we zoom out a bit, what is the life cycle of a scam, right? So we, at Meta, we use something we call the scams attack chain. And essentially this is a kill chain. So I come from the national security world. Kill chains are a way that you can map out like the stages of evolution of an attack, and then you can figure out where you can intervene to be most effective to break that attack off. So for scams, oftentimes this starts with building infrastructure. Right. So this is not something that often is happening on a service like ours. This is when a scammer or an organized criminal group actually goes and acquires physical assets. Right. So if you think about it, these groups need IT equipment, right? They need computers, they need phones, they need internet routers, they need to plug into a telecom somewhere. They need a physical location, right? So some of these scam centers are huge compounds, oftentimes operating on the border of Cambodia and Thailand. And so they need to actually build a facility. This early phase, that's where law enforcement and government are most often going to know what's happening and be able to intervene, right? Platform services like ours, we don't know if that phone or that router or whatever is going to connect to our services. The second phase of those operations, now they've got a building and a bunch of phones and an internet router, is preparing the actual digital assets they're going to use. Right? So this is creating fake accounts that might happen on Facebook or on YouTube or any other set of services. It might be buying or hacking people's accounts so they can use a real person's account to do the scam. And then they start to try to build that facade of legitimacy. Right? And so this is the point where platforms like ours can start to intervene by blocking fake account creation, taking down fake accounts, giving people their accounts back if they get hacked, that type of thing. The third phase, the email that you got, we call engagement. Right? And so this is when the scammers actually initiate contact with a potential target and start to try and build rapport with that target. That might be through an email. It might be through a SMS message trying to trick you into talking to a fake, help desk support person. And the goal there is often to try and move you to some one-to-one communication channel.
Got it. Okay.
Why? Right? Because let's say they post on Facebook and they post an ad on our services. The idea there is to get a bunch of people who might be interested. And to your point, maybe it's folks they're looking for people who would fall for that email. And then they say, all right, you know what? Your account was hacked. Contact us. They contact them. And now it's a phone call, right? Now a service like ours, our teams, we can't see what's happening anymore, right? And so they're trying to move people to these one-to-one communication channels, phone calls, email messages, text messages. And that's where the execution happens, right? So this is the next phase, when they actually convince you to part with your money or your information that might enable them to steal money from you. And this really underscores why the intelligence sharing in the space is so important, because if you think about this life cycle, if a law enforcement agency or a government saw scammers buying a bunch of phones or plugging into Cambodian telecommunication infrastructure, they could share that information, right, in a way that might enable services like ours to say, okay, well, accounts coming out of that compound are linked to this organized criminal group. If we saw a bunch of fake accounts getting created that were linked to a scam organization, we could share that information potentially with other partners in the financial services industry so that they would know, hey, these people have been contacted by a scammer, and they might down the line end up trying to send money through your service to them. And then finally, if a financial service company sees scams happening on their service platforms, if they tell us, that might help us then protect the potential victims on our services. So intel sharing has been a key piece of the strategy here, and it's because of that cross-platform nature of these threats.
I couldn't stop thinking about, like, in the old days, before there were police departments, before there were fire departments, right, before there was insurance to protect you against these perils, like, communities would just get together and protect themselves. And I know that digital at scale is way different than that, but the theory around it, or the possibilities around it, are not that different. It's just the scale thing that's different. You guys are doing this. Other companies are doing it as well. Is there a coordination among companies that says, like, look, none of this is good for any of us? We should just have some overriding way of saying, like, even though it's competitive, right? But if it's bad for you, it's bad for some other platform company as well, right? Because again, the reputation, you're all kind of associated in some way. So if it's bad over here, people are just going to presume it's bad over here. Is there some kind of coordination that's going on as well, without giving away like all the secrets around, yeah, we're working on this, but you guys should be working on this too, and maybe build some best practices between big companies on these big platforms?
That's happening in a couple of different places. And I'm happy you mentioned the competition piece, because these types of areas, like keeping people on our platform safe, are not areas where we're, worried about competing with each other's businesses
At all.
Right?
Yeah.
There's some, there was some interesting research that essentially showed that when somebody was the victim of a scam, that it essentially undermined their trust in whatever service they felt they had been scammed through, so much that they just weren't going to use it anymore. Right? Essentially, that company lost a customer for life. And so everybody has a business interest in making sure that this gets solved. Everybody has just, frankly, an ethical and a moral interest. I think I certainly have families and friends and relatives who have been targeted, in some cases victimized by scammers. I'm sure everyone else listening to this podcast can think of at least one person in their family.
I'm looking at one, actually, who's sitting in the room with me. I'm not kidding. Not you. I'm talking about somebody else, but yeah.
And so, to your question, though, there are a number of forums where that type of intelligence sharing happens. I'm actually in Washington, D.C. right now. I live in California for the Global Anti-Scams Alliance conference in D.C. And so GASA, the Global Anti-Scams Alliance, is one of the organizations that Meta is a founding member of, as well as a number of other companies, that's designed to convene and facilitate information sharing and sharing kind of best practices between industry companies, not just social media, but financial service companies, payment processors, telecommunications companies, social media companies. We also are part of the Global Signal Exchange, which is another organization that's really focused on facilitating actionable intelligence sharing between different industry companies that might have see different pieces of the scams puzzle. And then finally, one that I really want to mention is something called FIRE, the Fraud Intelligence Reciprocal Exchange. FIRE is a pilot program that we have with a number of financial services companies and banks. And the goal there is to close the gap where if we see someone being targeted, we obviously don't have their financial services information. We don't know what their bank is, right? That they might then try to wire money from. And similarly, a bank knows that this person's bank account has been compromised, or they've sent money to a scammer, but they don't know if they were contacted on Facebook or on X or on YouTube or what have you. And so the FIRE facilitates them sharing that type of information with us so that we can proactively go and see whether they may have been scam activity targeting them. So there are a number of those forums that are designed to enable that type of intel sharing.
FIRE sounds to me like neighborhood watch at scale. It's like, no one's coming after me, but I see somebody coming after you, and if they're coming after you, they're going to knock on my door next, per se. Let's protect everybody. But this was actually super interesting, and you made me think about this too, right? You mentioned in the border around Thailand and Cambodia, and I want to get into specific detail about that in a second, but it made me think about this. In the old days, right, if you saw, let's just use some big, mean country that didn't like the United States, but if you saw some big, mean country sending missiles to an island really close to your country, you'd be like, okay, this is bad. Something bad is potentially going to happen here. And you could see the boats coming and the missiles getting set up, and then you have the Bay of Pigs. But now what you're suggesting is that the weapons are changing, and that they're just turning into digital weapons, and that like you could look for higher energy grid use where it wasn't that high before, higher AI implementations, more token usage, right? And even large tech purchases, like buying 100 or 1,000 computers, whatever it is, and setting up, like you said, one of these places where they have to do this thing. And once you see it, you're like, this is not to do like anime. Right? This is not for like Japanese anime. This is for something else. And it just made me think about that, like, governments must be looking in different places for different threats now because the threats themselves have actually changed. But it also means that companies like yours are looking for different threats as well. Can you talk to me, because you mentioned, unless you want to comment on that, but can you talk to me about the Cambodia example that was in the report as well? Because I think this is actually really interesting, and I think it'll give people a window into where things are happening, why they're happening there, and what the outcomes are, if that's cool.
Absolutely. Well, I think, just to respond briefly to your comment, though, I think there is a really interesting geopolitical element to this. So most of my career pre-Facebook was focused on essentially kind of Russian malign influence, counterintelligence work, but, traditional diplomatic statecraft. And so, what's interesting about the organized criminal and kind of online scams environment is there is a geopolitical angle here. Right. The Cambodia example, I'll talk through that in a second. Right. We're often talking about massive physical scam compounds that operate in kind of these special economic zones in Cambodia, right on the Thai border. These are linked to, sophisticated, well-known organized criminal groups. Their workforce is in many cases the victims of other organized criminal activity, right? There's been a bunch of press coverage of this, but we've certainly also seen that some of those people sending you the emails and the text messages from the scam compounds in Cambodia are themselves victims of human trafficking who fell for labor scams and then were trafficked to the scam compounds in Cambodia. So there's a vicious cycle of crime here.
Yeah.
But the geopolitical angle is, right, if you are, I have been incredibly impressed with the Royal Thai Police, with the work the Singapore Police Force has done, with Taiwan CIB, that, there's too many to mention, but there's a bunch of police forces across Asia that have pivoted, I think, very effectively to understanding that the human trafficking and labor trafficking and offline crimes that they were, working to, fight with their organized criminal units have pivoted online and are working to build that international coalition. I think that's also something we at Facebook are quite interested in enabling, is how do we help those law enforcement agencies that want to hold these criminal groups that are largely kind of operating in areas that don't have rule of law accountable for what they're doing. So just to respond to that point, I think there is something important there.
The big platforms like yours also in some cases may have more detailed and granular information about activity because people are using the platforms to communicate with each other as well in a way that they may think is safe, but maybe not. Do you know what I mean? So there's so much activity going on there. And because it's digital, it's harder for non-platform natives, right? People that don't own the platform to actually see what's going on there. So you actually, in some cases, may have more information than the police, than the government, stuff like that. And that makes the dynamic change a little bit, I think. No?
I think that's right. The way I describe it when I talk to kind of folks who are now doing the job I used to do before I left government is, governments have a bunch of very unique, by virtue of being governments, unique abilities to collect information and intelligence, right? They have actual intelligence agencies, law enforcement. Platform companies, for a bunch of really good reasons, don't have that level of intelligence visibility. We can often see a lot of what happens on our services and not a lot of what happens everywhere else.
Right,
so
right.
The way that I think about our role in intel sharing is we have kind of a deep piece of the pie. It's just a very narrow one.
Right, not a broad one.
And if we don't share that, right, the people that can put all the pieces together aren't going to be able to put all the pieces together. So yes, to your point, I think we can see a lot in a narrow window. And the reason we have to share is there are people out there like federal law enforcement agencies that their job is to put all that stuff together and figure out how to go and arrest these people.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Let's talk about Cambodia.
Yeah. So, a concrete example, though, I think of what we're describing is there was a network in Cambodia, and there's a number of these. This is just illustrative of the type of thing that our teams are seeing. And so, earlier this year, we took down, I think, 6,400 Facebook accounts and pages between January and October. Right. So in the first part of the year, and the 6,400 accounts and pages were involved in fraud and scams activity linked to a criminal organization. They were based in Cambodia, but the activities that they were doing, they essentially impersonated Americans, Australians, Indonesians, people in the Philippines, Thais, and Vietnamese law enforcement and government officials.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the idea here was to try and use that impersonation to convince people that they were trustworthy, right? And this is actually one archetype of scams that makes me particularly angry. And frankly, I imagine our counterparts in law enforcement across Asia particularly frustrated, right? Is people are victims of a scam, right? Any kind of scam, a romance scam, someone steals their password, someone convinces them to send them a wire transfer, a refund. And what do? Right? They go online and they look for help from their local law enforcement or their federal law enforcement. And then what do they find? They find this criminal scam group impersonating that law enforcement organization. And so they reach out, right? And you'll see this actually on X when people say, "Oh, my account was hacked. I need help getting my account back." And there's like 100 replies of people being like, "Message my friend, whatever." Yeah.
Talk to Bob.
Pretty much all of those are scams.
Sure.
Right. And this is kind of a version of that where people would reach out and say, "Hey, I was scammed. Can you help me?" And they'll say, "Absolutely. We're the fraud recovery team of Vietnam," for example. And they're not, right? They're just another criminal organization. And in the course of trying to get that person, to give them their money, they might say, "Oh, we just need you to pay this fee to release the money back to you. We might need you to pay a transfer fee, and then we'll send the money back to you that we got back from the bad guys. Sure. We need to reimburse our expenses because we traveled to go and arrest the guys that scammed you." All of that's fake, right? And so that's what we saw this network doing. That's what we took down. And this network was also active across a number of different services, right? So not only were they using Facebook, but they were using a bunch of different platform services across the internet. And infrastructurally, right, we're plugged into both telecommunications, satellite communications. And so this is a great example of like the cross-platform nature of how we have to go after these threats. So we've taken them down, and we've continued to work with kind of governments and other law enforcement authorities to make sure they know what we were seeing, and hopefully they'll be able to do something about it.
I'm curious what you think about this, right? Because again, you just keep triggering things in my mind. I've always thought that like your online presence should mirror your offline presence, in the sense that I wouldn't believe anybody was a policeman who just like rocked up to my car, pulled me over, and like didn't have a badge, didn't have a gun, didn't have some kind of identifying, thing with him that said, or her that said that like they were officially police. And yet online, it just seems so easy to impersonate somebody, or just to say like, "Yeah, I'm from the FBI, so you need to do this thing, that thing, and the other thing." I know that there are blue checks and all this other stuff, but is there a better way, again, in your experience, to be able to say like, we know this is real? Because again, it's trust, right? Like if a guy shows up in a police uniform, even if it's fake, and has a badge and a number on it and his name, I'm just going to be like, okay, he must be a policeman. Do you know what I mean? Is there a way to mirror that online? Because the further we get into this, right, the more sophisticated the tools get. Now I want to talk about AI in a second as well, but how do we stop that first thing about mirroring more like the offline life?
Absolutely. There is an interesting fundamental tension in how to solve for that problem between privacy and freedom of expression on one side, and on safety and what we would call platform integrity on the other. And I think when you mentioned, we're probably going to talk about AI in a minute, as we think through the different interventions here, many of them fall somewhere on the in between those two extremes of kind of privacy and full expression and full safety and security. And the reason I say that is, when I first started working on these problems, one of the common suggestions to address things like fake accounts interfering in elections, for example, like foreign interference in elections, was, well, just everybody has to use their government name, provide a government ID to the platform before they can use the platform.
Standard stuff. That's everybody's idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And I used to work in government. That was I probably had that idea at one point before I joined Facebook, Meta, or Facebook at the time too. And I think once I had started working at the company, I realized a couple of things. One, when you start dealing with every country in the world, 3+ billion people, the edge cases aren't small numbers, right? You're dealing in many cases with countries, jurisdictions, localities that have, in some cases, no identification, no standardized identification. You're also oftentimes dealing with communities that use the internet to connect because they may not be able to do so as safely in their country or their locality, depending on where they are in the world.
So before you finish making that point, and just for people that are listening, I want to make a point about this because I think it's really important.
Yeah.
This idea that if you live in the United States, or if you live in Thailand, or if you live in Singapore, where they're all very formal ID structures that are very straightforward, there's no chance that you're going to be kicked off a platform if those are the rules. And that means that your digital connectivity is going to be there by default. But I want to make the point that what you're suggesting is that in many places in the world, 3.5 billion people connected on the platform, some of them would just by default not be allowed on for any reason at all because of the fact that they may not have that structured identity. And what you're saying is you'd have to remove so many people at some level. And this is not the only reason, but in a way, that in itself would be unfair.
To a sense, yes. And also that in many cases, those communities are the ones that like often benefit the most.
Exactly. That's my point
from
though, right?
being able to connect online.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a good way of putting it. And also that there are other ways. So like when Facebook looks for a fake account, right, an automated system, or even when our investigative teams are out there looking for networks of fake accounts, we aren't doing that by pulling up some big database of all the IDs in the world. We don't have that.
Right.
What we're doing instead is looking at how a fake account behaves.
I was going to say.
Which is often quite different than how a real person behaves.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I grew up in Ohio, a little state in the United States. I have a couple, if you looked at my social graph, right, I have friends that I made in Ohio. I met them. I connected with them when I was there. I moved to DC for my career. Organically, my network grew. That network had interconnectivity because all those people knew each other too, because that's how social networks work in real life. I moved to California. Same thing happened. Fake accounts don't look like that. Right? It's one of the reasons we often see scammers try to hack people's accounts is because if you can steal someone else's identity, then you steal kind of the authenticity that they had to start with. And so, it's easy to say, just get everyone's ID, that solves everything. The reality is there are very powerful data analytics around, for example, behavior and technical signals that we use to identify these things that enable us to remove on the billions of accounts a year when they're created or shortly after they're created and start to behave like inauthentic assets on the platform. So that's one piece. You'd mentioned you wanted to talk about AI. So I was going to mention, I think, some of the other tools out there that
Please,
can help
go
combat
for it.
this stuff.
Go for it.
So the example I used from Cambodia is an example of this kind of police impersonation or law enforcement impersonation. Another variant of that is something we would call celeb bait or celebrity bait, essentially using the image of a popular, well-known person, Jensen Huang, Elon Musk in the US, to try and get people to engage, to add credibility, to pretend maybe even to be that person. So something that we trialed earlier this year was, could we use facial recognition technology? Could we use it in two places? First, could we use facial recognition technology to counter celeb bait or law enforcement impersonation, right? So if the head of the Royal Thai Police were to opt in, could we essentially scan ads that are using his image? And if they match to his image and they're not from the Royal Thai Police, then we don't allow the ad to run. And we've seen that be a pretty effective tool. Now, going back to that privacy versus security trade-off, we've had to be really careful here, right? This is an opt-in program. We're working with a subset of people who are often the victims of this type of celeb bait. But we've seen, I think, real promise from being able to leverage this type of technology. Second place that we're using that type of technology, I'd mentioned that if a scammer could steal someone's account, right, they get to steal that person's authenticity, right, more so than if they create a fake account. And so we've really prioritized helping people get back into their accounts if they're hacked. One way to do that is if they can prove that the person using the phone is who they say they are, then we can let them into the account more quickly. And so we've launched kind of another pilot of giving people the ability to record a video selfie. It creates a face print, which we don't store. It's just used to match to the historical face in the pictures on that account. And then if it matches, they get back into their account and they can reset it. That takes a couple of minutes compared to, I think, a much more arduous process that we used to have before. And so we've seen that be really effective, right? Because if we can kind of pull out the rug of stolen, compromised accounts from scammers, now we're making it a lot harder for those scammers to operate, and frankly, making people's lives a lot easier because their accounts are getting back to them. So that's two examples. There's a couple of other ways we're using AI that we should talk about that are pretty cool. But I think those are really salient given what we were just talking about.
So you just reminded me of this thing. You said celeb bait, right? I remember it was like a year and a half ago. I'm a big UFC fan, right? So I watch fighting all the time. I can't wait for this weekend, by the way. Last weekend was kind of amazing. Everyone has their own things that they like. I don't know if you know Chris Cyborg, but somebody who was impersonating her, I believe, reached out to me. And the thought that I had was, and I talk about this a lot, is like, there's no way she's going to reach out to me. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not getting a phone call from Brad Pitt. Brad Pitt. He doesn't want to know cool restaurants in Bangkok from Michael Waitze. But I do understand that maybe there is a part of the general population that feels like, okay, maybe I did something special, and that celeb bait is actually a real problem, right? Because the idea that I could potentially talk to somebody famous, and with AI being able to generate kind of anything, even voice now as well, right? Things do get kind of tricky. Is there like an arms race going on? Do you know what I mean?
I think any new technology will see both a bunch of adversarial bad guys trying to figure out how to use it, and teams like ours who are also trying to figure out how can we use this to augment what we're doing. You saw this with cybersecurity back in the day. I think you're seeing that now with AI. So, where we've seen AI in the fraud and scam space kind of leveraged by scammers, one of the most common places is just content generation. So, your ChatGPTs of the world are really good at generating a much more convincing email from your bank than the typo ridden bad English or bad Thai or pick your language email from your bank that you used to get from a scammer. And so, using AI just to generate a better phishing lure, spear phishing lure, ad copy, what have you. Similarly, using AI to generate kind of imagery. So we've seen that not just in the scam space. We had an example of an influence operation that targeted a number of communities around the world and used AI to generate protest posters. And so it's kind of, I imagine what we're seeing here are scammers like cutting out their marketing team and just using AI to do it for them.
They have marketing teams. I like this.
You're right. That part of AI adoption, we haven't seen like any major impacts to our ability to detect this activity because they're using AI. Again, because we're often relying on kind of that behavioral and technical signal set, and that stuff's still there. Where we've seen AI, not on our services, but kind of in the broader scams ecosystem, you'd mentioned kind of voice cloning or deep fake video. Certainly been press coverage on this as well, right? But using deep fake videos to social engineer individuals into sending money or sending a wire transfer. Or one that I think is particularly frustrating for me is using kind of cloned audio to try and target like elders, right? Yeah. So reaching out to someone's grandma and pretending to be their grandson and granddaughter and saying, oh, I've been imprisoned and on my vacation to wherever, and you need to post bail or I'm going to be in jail for the rest of my life. The urgency plus the convincing nature of the audio, that can be really potent, right? And so that's the bad guy side. There are a couple places where AI is, I think, really revolutionizing the defense side of this work. Two great examples. First one would be the way that we're using large language models to detect scams as they're developing and then try to nudge potential victims away from them. LLMs are great at understanding conversational patterns. And so what we've done is essentially train an LLM that can recognize scam archetypes, right? And so I'd mentioned one of the common tactics, right, is like engaging with someone, building rapport, and then try to move them to another service. And so if someone does that in Messenger, like if a scammer does that in Messenger, and we see that there's some suspicious signals around their account, and the LLM says, whoa, this conversation is starting to look like one of those scam archetypes, right? They're asking you to go over to Zelle, or they're asking you to send them a text message and you're not connected to this person and it looks like a romance scam.
Yeah, let's move this conversation to Signal, or let's move it somewhere else where it's going to be highly encrypted or whatever. Yeah,
exactly. The idea is it'll essentially pop up like an interstitial to the user and say, hey, this conversation looks like a common scam archetype. You should be very careful about sharing information with this person. Do you want to end the conversation and report it? And so, going back to that privacy and security discussion, that is running on device, right? So it's an on-device machine learning model. So messages isn't going over to Facebook and then Facebook is running this in our models. This is happening on your device. And then if you decide to report it to us, then it comes over, then we can review it further with a more robust language model that can say, yeah, that's a scam and we're going to go and further investigate the account. But the user still has been given this chance before they're deep into the relationship to get out of that conversation. And we found that early intervention is incredibly important.
It's so funny. I was going to ask you if you guys actually did that. I've never seen that, but I was going to ask if your model is starting to understand, like, wait, this looks like some kind of fraud. Maybe we should pop something up or just say, you may want to be a little bit more careful here. Like your dad tapping you on the shoulder and going, yeah, don't go over there. Like the stove is hot kind of thing.
There's an offline version of this where we and others work with federal law enforcement, the FBI in the United States. And the FBI's job is to then reach out to the potential victim and say, you might be the victim of a scam. Now, there's a bunch of challenges here, especially if someone calls you from the FBI.
Sure, it's like
scammers are also calling people and saying they're from the FBI.
Right.
But we have found, I think the FBI has found that early intervention is super important, because once someone gets really far down the relationship with the scammer, it can be very hard to convince them to disengage.
Sure, because it's been safe up until now, and I've been dealing with them for like a day or 2 days or 3 days, so nothing bad's happened. Why are you telling me now something bad's going to happen? It's easier on day one to just go, or you need to be careful. Sorry, go ahead.
No, or they have lost money, but they're in, right? And pulling out would mean accepting that they've lost $10,000, their whole life savings, right? That they were a victim of the scam. It can be incredibly embarrassing. Like people feel, when I've talked to a couple of folks who are victims of scams, and, the number one thing you hear, besides obviously the hurt of losing, in some cases, all of your money, is the embarrassment that they fell for it, right? They don't want to tell anybody because how could they have fallen for that email or that phone call or thought that guy was from the FBI? But these people are sophisticated criminals, right? They are playing on emotions just like a high pressure salesman. And so, the earlier you can break someone out, the more successful and the safer it's going to be.
I actually met somebody recently who was telling me that they got scammed for like a real decent amount of money. And you're right. The initial scam on them was small, and they actually did more until they lost like 20 grand. It's like a lot of money. And they were embarrassed. You're right. It's hard. I want to talk about, so I have a friend who runs a cybersecurity company, and he used to be a Green Beret. And one of the things he said to me was he feels like he's fighting war, but he's fighting it on a different surface. Right? And once he said that to me, it made me rethink the way I think about surfaces and platforms and things like that. I forget what year it was. You'll remember better than I, but like Facebook changed their name from Facebook to Meta for a bunch of different reasons, but not the least of which is similar to why Apple Computer changed its name from Apple Computer to Apple. Because it was no longer just a computer company, in the same way that Meta is no longer just a Facebook company. But one of the things that you're doing that's super interesting to me is the glasses. But this is just another surface that has different inputs, different outputs, and different information. When you think about what the future of these scams and frauds look like, how do you address it on the different platforms and surfaces that you're building as well? Is that fair?
Yeah, it's a great question. So an example, because the glasses are still pretty new.
Yeah. But again, they're not going away.
Right, exactly. So how do we think about this, right? One of the things that my team does, we kind of piloted this 5 years ago, is this idea of red teaming. So your friend probably is familiar with red teaming or wargaming, probably when he was in the Green Beret. This idea of like, all right, let's go play act the bad guy. Right? There's versions of this in cybersecurity around penetration testing. Our version is, if we were the bad guy targeting this product, how would we break it? Not just break it to like break in through the network and steal data, but how could we misuse it? And then take that wargaming, the red teaming, and build product changes to close those vulnerabilities, right? And so, your friend mentioned fighting on a new surface. I often like to talk about doing security work at a platform company as one in which you are fighting in a different battle space, but you control that battle space, right? So traditional warfare, right? You had to pick your battles, right? If you think back to any of the grand battles of ancient history, right? Like Alexander the Great or the Battle of Thermopylae, like they were all about finding the right terrain, positioning your army, fighting so the sun is in your enemy's eyes. One of the interesting things about working on a platform, any of Meta's platforms, is you can move the mountains, right? You can move the rivers. You can raise or lower the sun, right? You can change how the product works to make it harder for bad guys to misuse it. So an example, WhatsApp, which is maybe a good proxy for the glasses, in that WhatsApp is one of our newer services. So on WhatsApp, one of the tactics that we saw scammers start to do is they would ask people to screen share their phone during a video call. or if they're using desktop, screen share their desktop. Why? Because they wanted to see, for example, online banking details that might be on their phone. Right. So if they're impersonating a bank help desk person or whatever, they'd be on a WhatsApp call and they'd say, all right, well, I'm requesting screen share on your phone. One thing that we did was whenever that happens now, people are getting an interstitial warning that says, this person is an unknown contact requesting to share your screen. That might mean that they are trying to steal your bank information. They may ask you for sensitive information like verification codes or SMS two-factor authentication codes. Do not share your screen. If you do not know this person personally, click here not to do it. That is an example similar to the interstitials in Messenger that are designed to give people the tools to protect themselves, even where we as the platform may not have the signal to 100% definitively say that this is a scammer, right? If we knew 100% is a scammer, taking them off the platform, right? There's no question about it. But if we're not sure, but there's some signals that things might be hinky, this is one way to give people those tools. And so as we build a new product, whether that's the Ray-Ban glasses or even the AI products that we're releasing, thinking through the adversarial use case as part of that process.
So what would happen if, and again, I would never share my screen with somebody if I didn't know them, just never, but I understand that some people do. But if they did and they received a message, right, and this is me thinking like a criminal, which is hard for me to do in some cases, right? But if that criminal knows that that's going to happen, right, because they test this stuff too, they may say like, so I'm going to ask you to share your screen. You may get a message that says like, I'm trying to steal your bank information. This is not true. I'm just trying to help you out. Like, how do you fix that little, it's very nuanced, right? Because like you did have the pop-up, but there's somebody also there going, yeah, look, you may get this pop-up, but ignore that. That's a systemic thing that no one's really looking at and blah, blah, blah. Like, how do you fix that part of it? Or how do you think about it at least?
Totally. So it's interesting because the first thing that popped into my mind is banks have actually had to deal with this for a long time.
Yeah.
If you listen to scam bait phone calls, which has become a bit of a hobby of mine now that I've been doing so much work on scams, it's cathartic to hear the scammers getting frustrated. But one thing you'll often hear is, right, as they think the victim is at the bank, they're giving that person instructions to say, all right, you're going to tell the teller exactly this. Do not say that you're sending this wire, you're wiring this money to the FBI for whatever the reason they gave you. Right. You have to tell them you're sending it for a friend. Payment processors deal with this all the time, right? PayPal has a friends and family, and then PayPal has a business one. And the business one protects your money in case you got scammed, and the friends and family doesn't. So what do you think the scammers tell them to do? Use the friends and family one. And so some of this goes back to intel sharing. If we, for example, are building this interstitial around screen sharing, can the banks build into their apps that when someone tries to screen share, it blanks the screen? You'll actually see this in some online banking applications on phones, that if the phone starts to do a screen share, the app actually just blanks out. And so there's there's synergies here, where if we start to see a tactic like the screen sharing in WhatsApp, we can use, for example, Fire or a global signal exchange to share with banks to say, we're seeing people screen sharing to steal bank verification codes. Can you, you should think about whether there's something you can do there to make it harder. And so there's two sides to the coin. One is educating people that this might be a tactic and they need to be careful. And the second one is, how do we collectively raise defenses across the industry so that the ways these guys try to get around us are less and less effective? But it is an ever evolving problem, right? The crime goes back really, really far, well before the internet.
Exactly.
And I expect we will be adapting and evolving for as long as scammers are out there, and I expect to be for a while.
Unless there's some other topic you want to cover, I'll let you go in a moment because I really appreciate your time and I know it's getting late for you, but I wanted to share one other thing with you if you don't mind. I pay my rent via my banking app. I pay it through my Thai banking account, and because the number is larger than a normal number that I would pay for something on a day-to-day basis, it always says to me, I like the way you're laughing at me, he's dancing around not saying how much money he's paying in rent.
It's okay. I live in San Francisco, so
at least you get the joke. But what it makes me do is, and it doesn't make me do this for any other payment I make, it makes me hold up the phone with my camera and look into the screen to verify that it's actually me. But that's kind of easy to replicate. But then it makes me, you may have seen me blinking and you're like, why is the dude blinking? Because I was remembering that app also makes me blink 3 times. and it makes me smile with my teeth. So like it does all these little things, and I can't presume that they figured that out on their own. I love my bank, and they've actually been super secure and all this other stuff. But it must have been some sort of coordinated effort of like, that's a really good way to stop people from scamming you and taking your money, is that they can't, even if they have your phone, be you and then blink 3 times if they're using like a picture to do this and that kind of stuff. So it just falls into the category that you were talking about. Anyway.
Totally.
Yeah. Is there anything
it's
else?
Actually an interesting
Sorry, go ahead.
analog to the facial recognition technology I mentioned. I imagine it probably works very similar.
Exactly. Is there anything else that you want to cover that I missed?
I think we covered a lot. If there's maybe one thing I'd want to just touch on, because I imagine a lot of your listeners or viewers are probably thinking this. A question that I always get is like, why does Meta care about this? Why do you care about scams, right? Like if these scammers are buying ads, why don't you just let them do that? I got that question when I worked on influence operations, right? Why do you care about foreign interference in elections? What I think I would just want to leave people with, because it's something that I think I've seen over and over at my time at the company and working with other companies, is our services are like we're a social media company, right? At the end of the day, that is about connecting people and making sure that people feel comfortable connecting on our services. People aren't going to want to connect with other people on our services or be on our services if they don't feel safe, right? If they don't trust who they're talking to is who they say they are, if they don't trust that the communities that they join are actually about the things that the communities say they're about. And so, it's I think actually a business imperative for us to get this right. In the same way that making sure that we're taking down fake accounts and keeping, different groups and pages safe. We want to make sure that people know that they can use our services safely and that they're not going to be the target or the victim of these types of scams. So, it's one of the reasons we take this stuff so seriously, and why I really believe that we can secure our platforms, but also that we can work with our partners and get to a good place.
Yeah, I mean, look, my grandfather told me when I was a little boy, it takes a lifetime to build a reputation and a moment to lose it. And it's really important, if you want to have a good reputation, to just continually work to make sure that people trust you. Like, it's just super important.
Absolutely.
Whether you're an individual or a platform. Okay. David Agranovich, Director of Global Threat Disruption at Meta. I really appreciate your time. It's been a long day. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for doing this today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you as well. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks for the great conversation.